My name is Molly Collins, a 27-year-old specialist in the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army. I used to be a real, screaming eagle. Now, I'm just a ghost behind a desk. This morning, Sergeant Evans threw a thick manila folder onto my desk, so hard it sloshed my lukewarm coffee over the rim of its ceramic mug. "Collins," she hissed, her contempt unconcealed. "Stop daydreaming about jumping out of airplanes. You are not a paratrooper anymore. You're a broken stapler. Try to be useful or get the hell out of my sight." Her words hurt more than my shattered ankle ever did. I could only lower my head, feeling the pitying glances of the other soldiers slide off me. She didn't know that the one skill she and my own family considered my most useless, sign language, was about to make the most powerful man on this base fall silent. Before we begin, I have a question for you. Have you ever been looked down on by someone? Let me know in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever had someone make you feel small, but you knew deep down you were meant for something greater. The file landed with a sound like a gunshot in the dead quiet office. A sharp, flat smack that made everyone flinch, but only for a second. Then, silence. The dark, bitter coffee bled across the cheap laminate of my government issue desk, pooling around the base of my monitor. The acrid smell of burnt coffee, a permanent feature of this place, suddenly seemed 10 times stronger, thick enough to choke on. Sergeant Evans stood over me, her shadow swallowing the weak light from the buzzing fluorescent tubes above. Her words, a broken stapler, hung in the air, echoing in the suffocating stillness that followed. I didn't look at her. I didn't look at anyone. My eyes were fixed on the brown puddle spreading toward a stack of paperwork. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but on the outside, I was stone. I had learned to be stone. The silence was the worst part. It was a living thing, heavy and judgmental. In that silence, I felt every eye in the room on me, first in shock, and then, in a calculated shift, away from me. No one said a word. Not a, "Hey, take it easy, Sergeant," or even a quiet, "You okay, Collins?" Nothing. To my left sat Specialist Miller. Just last week, Miller and I had sat across from each other in the DFAC, the dining facility, laughing over dry Salisbury steak and instant mashed potatoes. We'd swapped stories about basic training, about the shared misery that forges bonds stronger than blood. He'd told me about his kid back in Ohio. I'd told him about my brother, Danny. We were supposed to be brothers in arms. Now, Miller's eyes were glued to his computer screen with an intensity I knew was fake. His fingers were frozen over his keyboard. He wasn't typing. He was pretending I didn't exist. He was pretending he hadn't just witnessed my public execution. The cowardice of it, the deliberate act of looking away, felt like a deeper betrayal than Evans's attack. I wasn't just being humiliated, I was being abandoned, cast out. The message was clear: you're on your own. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for the roll of cheap brown paper towels on the corner of my desk. My movements felt sluggish, heavy as if I were moving through water. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from a white-hot rage that was boiling up from my gut. It was a fury so pure it felt like ice in my veins. I pressed the paper towel into the spilled coffee, watching the dark stain absorb. I stared down at my hand. This hand, it used to be so capable. This was the hand that had learned the intricate, life-saving folds of a T-11 parachute, a process so precise it felt like prayer. It was the hand that had gripped the cold, familiar steel of my M4 rifle on countless qualification ranges, steady and sure. It was the hand that had pulled my ripcord, trusting my own packing to carry me safely from the sky. Now, that same hand was shaking as it wiped up a mess made by someone else's contempt. The image was a perfect, brutal symbol of what I had become. Not just in their eyes, but in my own. A fall from the sky to a puddle on a desk. The paratrooper was gone. Only the broken stapler remained, cleaning up its own pathetic mess. I balled up the soggy paper towel, my knuckles white, and threw it into the small trash can beneath my desk. It landed with a soft, unsatisfying thud. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was a flicker of the old defiance, the paratrooper who never looked down. but I lifted my head. I forced my eyes away from the stain on my desk and scanned the room. Most of the senior NCOs and lower enlisted were already back to their feigned work, the rhythm of typing cautiously resuming. But I caught the eyes of two young privates standing by the water cooler. They couldn't have been more than 19, fresh from Fort Benning, still filled with that fire and belief in the Army's ideals of loyalty and respect. They weren't looking at me with disgust or scorn. It was worse. It was pity. That look, that soft, well-meaning, utterly devastating look, was the final blow. Contempt I could handle, dislike I could ignore. But pity? Pity from two soldiers I outranked, two kids who probably still had posters of screaming eagles on their bedroom walls? Pity was a confirmation. It was the universe telling me that they were right. I was no longer a protector. I was something to be protected. A charity case, a wounded bird with a broken wing that everyone felt sorry for but no one knew what to do with. I would have rather taken a punch to the jaw, a punch you can recover from. That look would scar. My face burned with a shame so hot it felt like it was peeling my skin off. My throat closed up, tight and aching. I dropped my chin to my chest and stared at the wood grain of my desk, focusing on a tiny knot in the particle board, anything to anchor myself. I felt myself shrinking, dissolving, wishing I could just melt into the worn fabric of my government-issue office chair and disappear completely. And then, a sound ripped through the quiet, a shrill electronic ring. It was my desk phone, an old beige Cisco model that probably predated the internet. The sound was unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Every head snapped in my direction again. My personal hell had just found a new soundtrack. The small screen lit up with the caller ID. 2 words glowed in black digital letters. Mom. A wave of dread washed over me, colder and more terrifying than the anger had been. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force the tremor out of my voice before I answered. I knew I had to pick up. Not answering would only lead to a dozen more calls. I reached for the receiver, my hand still trembling slightly. I thought, for a desperate second, that maybe this was a lifeline. A voice of comfort from the outside world. But I was wrong. I didn't know it then, but this call wasn't an act of salvation. It was the opening of a second front. It was an incoming attack from a direction I never should have trusted, a wound that would cut deeper and hurt more than anything that had just happened. I lifted the receiver, my palm slick with sweat against the cool plastic. I pressed it to my ear, my jaw aching as I forced a sound past the tightness in my throat. Hey, Mom. Molly, honey, I was just thinking about you. Her voice was a wave of forced cheerfulness, the kind she used at church when someone asked about Dad's temper. A flimsy shield of suburban pleasantness. How are you doing, sweetie? How's the ankle? It's fine, Mom. I'm fine, I lied. The words tasted like ash. My back was still burning with the memory of 100 pairs of eyes. She didn't ask about my day or my job. She never did. To her, this desk was a purgatory, a waiting room for my real life to resume. Her questions were always the same hopeful, prodding litany. Any news from the doctors? When do you think you'll get back in the air? Your father and I saw a documentary on the Normandy jumps, and we were just saying how proud we are of our little screaming eagle. My little screaming eagle. I wasn't little, and I wasn't soaring. I was grounded, a fact she refused to see. I tried to deflect. Actually, things are okay. I've been busy. I started teaching a small ASL class for a few of the military families on post. For their kids, it's been rewarding. The line went quiet. Then I heard it. A soft, disappointed sigh. It was a sound I knew better than my own name, a puff of air that could deflate my soul. Molly, she said, her voice losing its fake brightness. You really should be focusing on your physical therapy. All that hand-waving stuff. What good is that going to do? It's just a hobby, honey. Besides, your brother has those wonderful new hearing aids now. He's doing just fine. Just a hobby. The phrase cut through me, clean and deep. A hobby. That one word erased a decade of my life. It erased the library books, The late nights practicing in front of the mirror until my fingers ached with the effort of shaping a new language. It erased the simple, beautiful fact that I had built a bridge of words with my own two hands to keep my brother from being stranded on an island of silence. All of it dismissed. Before I could form a defense, I heard a rustling sound. "Here, let me talk to her," a deep voice rumbled. My father. My stomach dropped. He was a retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, a man who saw the world in two shades, strength and weakness. There was no in-between. "Molly," he said. His voice was low, devoid of warmth, heavy with a disappointment that felt like a physical weight. "I ran into General Miller at the Kroger yesterday, over by the deli counter." I held my breath, saying nothing. "He asked how you were doing, asked what you were up to." A long, crushing pause filled the line. I could picture him in their quiet Tennessee kitchen, his back rigid with a shame that was meant for me. I didn't know what to say to him, Molly. What was I supposed to say? That my daughter, a paratrooper, is sitting behind a desk stamping papers? He didn't yell. He never did. The silence that followed his question was 1,000 times louder than any reprimand. It was a verdict. In his world, a world built on the rigid pride of Southern military towns, I was no longer an asset to the family name. I was an embarrassment. A story he couldn't tell his friends at the VFW hall. Then my mother's voice cut back in, sharp, as if to drive the point home. "And look at Danny," she said, her voice a cruel whisper. "Despite his challenges, he's going to college for engineering. He's building a future. What are you doing, Molly?" That was the final blow. Danny. My Danny. The little boy whose world I'd fought so hard to keep open, now being used as the yardstick to measure my failure. They didn't see the years I spent making sure he was never made to feel less than. They only saw what I had lost, not what I possessed. They were no different from Sergeant Evans. They saw a broken thing. "I have to go," I mumbled, my voice thick. "I have work." I hung up before they could say another word, placing the receiver gently back in its cradle. A quiet, defeated gesture. The silence of the office rushed back in, but it was different now, echoing with their invisible words. A profound, terrifying emptiness settled over me. The barracks were just a place to store my gear. They were never a home. But now, the house I grew up in, the place that was supposed to be my sanctuary, wasn't safe anymore either. Both of my worlds had just rejected me. My universe had shrunk to the size of this desk. The gray fabric-covered walls of my cubicle suddenly felt like they were closing in, the air thick and unbreathable. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I stood, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. I didn't grab my cover, didn't look at anyone. I just walked. I walked past the desks of the people who had watched me fall apart, out of the office and through the main doors of the division headquarters. The humid Tennessee air hit my face, heavy and damp, but it was freedom compared to the recycled air inside. I started walking with no destination in mind, my feet moving across the manicured lawns of the post. My mind was a storm of shame and hurt. Broken stapler, just a hobby, stamping papers. My aimless path led me toward the Division Memorial Park, a solemn place of black granite walls. And that's when I saw him. An old man standing alone in front of one of the walls, nearly invisible against the polished stone. A forgotten relic, being ignored by a world that was moving too fast. If you've ever felt like the one person you needed to understand you was the one person who refused to, please support this story by hitting the like button. And in the comments, just type the words, "I understand." Because sometimes just knowing you're not alone is the one thing that gets you through. My boots crunched softly on the gravel path as I walked, the sound doing little to break the heavy silence in my own head. The thick, humid Tennessee air felt like a wet blanket, but I barely noticed. I was numb, adrift in the wreckage of my morning. My feet carried me without direction until I found myself standing at the edge of the Division Memorial Park. It was a quiet, solemn place. Long, polished walls of black granite stood in silent formation, their surfaces etched with the names of the fallen. Screaming eagles from World War II, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. a silent testament to the cost of our creed. And standing before one of those walls was an old man. He wasn't reading the names. He wasn't tracing a finger over the carved letters or leaving a flower at the base. He was just standing there. He wore a simple pair of khaki pants and a light blue polo shirt. On his head was a faded olive-drab veteran's cap, the kind you see at every 4th of July parade. His shoulders were slumped, not just with age, but with a weariness that seemed to radiate from him, a deep, settled exhaustion. The park was far from empty. Young soldiers in their OCPs, operational camouflage pattern uniforms, were bustling back and forth on the surrounding sidewalks, their strides full of purpose and energy. They were the present, a vibrant, full-color world of urgent tasks and digital precision. The old man, by contrast, was a black and white photograph in a digital age. He was a relic, a living artifact from a war that most of these young soldiers had only read about in history books. He seemed utterly out of place, a ghost haunting a world that had long since moved on. And in that moment, something inside me, something buried deep beneath the layers of shame and anger, recognized him, not his face, but his invisibility. I felt an immediate, startling connection to this stranger. I was a relic, too, an artifact from a different era. The era of 6 months ago, when I was still one of them, a paratrooper, whole. Now I was just as lost, just as out of sync with the world rushing past me. As I stood there watching, a group of young lieutenants walked by, their conversation loud and full of easy laughter. They were sharp, confident, the future leaders of the division. They glanced at the old man, a fleeting, dismissive look, the kind you give a piece of landscaping or a park bench. Their eyes slid right off him, as if he were part of the scenery, a harmless statue. The old man seemed to notice them. He straightened up slightly and raised a hand in a tentative, aborted wave, a gesture of hopeful connection. One of the lieutenants gave him a curt, almost imperceptible nod before they all hurried on their way, their laughter already resuming down the path. I saw the man's shoulders slump again. I saw the flicker of confusion and a touch of shame cross his face. He was trying to connect, trying to speak a language of shared experience that the world had apparently forgotten. He was reaching out from his silent world, and no one was reaching back. My heart ached for him, a dull, painful throb. A voice in my head, a voice that sounded a lot like my own, whispered, "Go talk to him." I took a half step forward, my body responding before my mind could object. But then, other voices flooded in, louder and crueler. Sergeant Evans's sneer, "Stop daydreaming. You're a broken stapler." My father's weary disappointment. What was I supposed to say? That my daughter is stamping papers? The voices formed a chorus of doubt and fear. "Don't get involved. Don't draw attention to yourself. You're not a paratrooper anymore. Remember, you're just a clerk. A liability. What could you possibly do?" The fear of another humiliation, another person looking at me with pity or contempt, was a physical thing. It was a cold hand that gripped my stomach and stopped me in my tracks. Fear won. I turned away from the old man and the silent wall of names. With a heavy, suffocating sense of shame, I started walking back toward the gray, soulless fortress of the division headquarters building. Every step felt like a betrayal. I had just become one of them. One of the people who glanced away, who hurried past, who chose the safety of indifference over the risk of connection. I had seen a brother in arms left behind, and I had left him there. A wave of self-loathing washed over me, so bitter it made me want to be sick. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and entered the main lobby, the cool air conditioning a welcome shock after the oppressive heat outside. The lobby was a cavern of polished floors and imposing portraits of stern-faced generals. I kept my head down, wanting nothing more than to retreat to the anonymity of my cubicle and wait for the day to end. But as I passed the main information desk, I froze. He was there. The old man from the memorial. He was standing at the high marble counter, trying to communicate with the specialist on duty. The soldier behind the desk was young, barely out of his teens, with a fresh haircut and an air of bored impatience. "Sir, I don't understand you," the specialist said, his his voice unnecessarily loud, as if raising the volume could somehow break through a language barrier. It was the way people often spoke to the elderly, or to foreigners, a condescending loudness that accomplished nothing. The old man gestured with his hands, a look of growing frustration on his face. "Sir, I don't know what that means," the specialist said, shaking his head. He let out an exasperated sigh and pushed a notepad and a cheap Bic pen across the counter. "Look, can you just write it down? Please?" And with that, the young soldier turned away to answer a ringing phone, dismissing the old man completely. He left him standing there, staring at the pen and paper as if they were alien objects, his shoulders slumped in that same weary defeat I had seen just moments before. I stood there, hidden behind a large pillar, my heart pounding. This was it. This was a test. A do-over. God or the universe, or whatever cosmic force was at play, had just given me a second chance. All the voices of fear and doubt were still screaming in my head, but this time, another voice was rising to meet them. A quieter, steadier voice. I looked at the old man, abandoned and misunderstood at a desk meant to provide information and assistance. I looked at the young soldier, so wrapped up in his own small world that he couldn't see the man in front of him. This time, I wouldn't turn away. I stood behind the pillar, my feet rooted to the polished floor. The world seemed to slow down. The ambient noise of the lobby, the echo of boots, the distant ringing of phones, the low hum of the air conditioning, fading into a dull roar in my ears. All I could see was the old man, alone at the counter, and the young specialist who had turned his back on him. My mind was a battlefield. The voices of my tormentors swirled like a hurricane. "You're a broken stapler." Evans's hiss was sharp, metallic. What was I supposed to say? My father's voice heavy with the weight of my failure. "It's just a hobby, honey." My mother's casual, soul-crushing dismissal. They were all there, a firing squad of my own insecurities, their words loaded and aimed right at my heart. "Don't do it," they screamed. "You're nobody. You're useless. Getting involved will only make things worse. You'll be humiliated all over again." But this time, another image pushed through the storm. It was the face of my brother, Danny, when he was 8 years old. I saw him at the dinner table, surrounded by the loud, overlapping chatter of our family, his eyes wide with confusion and loneliness, completely lost in a sea of sounds he couldn't understand. And then I saw the brilliant, explosive smile that lit up his entire face the first time I signed to him. "I hear you." That memory was stronger than their poison. My own shame, my own feeling of being abandoned at that desk this morning, was stronger than my fear. This man was not my brother, but his isolation was the same. His silence was the same. And I could not be the one to turn my back. I took a single, deep breath. It was a conscious, deliberate act. The same kind of breath I used to take standing in the open door of a C-130, the wind screaming past, the green light just moments from flashing. It was the breath of commitment, the breath before the jump. I stepped out from behind the pillar. The fearful, obedient Specialist Collins who cleaned up coffee and endured humiliation. I left her behind. My boots made a solid, determined sound on the floor as I walked to the counter. "Excuse me, Specialist," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The young soldier on the phone glanced up, annoyed. I didn't wait for his permission. I turned my body to face the old man, creating a small, quiet space for just the two of us in the middle of the chaotic lobby. I stood at a respectful version of attention and brought my hands up to the space in front of my chest. Slowly, clearly, I began to sign, letting my hands do the talking. My voice was too afraid to use. "Hello, sir," my hands said. "I am Specialist Collins. Do you need help?" The change that came over the man's face was nothing short of a miracle. It was like watching the sun break through a week of storm clouds. The deep furrows of frustration on his brow smoothed out. The confusion in his eyes vanished, replaced first by utter astonishment, then by a wave of relief so profound it seemed to take 20 years off his age. And then, a smile bloomed on his face, a pure, unguarded joy like that of a child who has just been given a long-awaited gift. his own hands weathered and spotted with age, came up to answer me. They were surprisingly nimble, his movements fluid and precise, a stark contrast to his weary posture. "Thank God," he signed, his relief a palpable thing. Finally, someone who understands. The world outside our silent conversation disappeared. The specialist on the phone, the officers striding by, the echoing noise of the lobby. It all melted away into an insignificant blur. There was only this man and the graceful, eloquent language that flowed between us. It was an oasis of perfect clarity. "I'm trying to see my son," he explained. "They told me he would be here." "Who is your son, sir?" I signed, my curiosity growing. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, as if he wasn't sure he should say. Then, with a quiet dignity, his hands formed the words. He signed a first name, a last name, and a rank. A rank and a name that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. General Michael Vance. My own hands faltered mid-air. The entire world, which had just shrunk to this small, quiet space between us, came crashing back in with the force of a tidal wave. General Michael Vance, the commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division, the man they called the Eagle of Kandahar. He was a living legend on this post, a figure so powerful and remote he might as well have been a god on Mount Olympus. And I, Specialist Molly Collins, the broken stapler, had just inserted myself directly into his family business. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had crossed a line. This wasn't just helping an old man anymore. This was a career-ending level of overstepping. I swallowed hard and signed again, my movements suddenly clumsy. "You mean General Vance is your son?" He nodded, a simple, proud gesture. Fighting to keep my composure, I turned to the now available specialist at the desk, who was watching us with a look of complete bewilderment. "I need to contact the general's office," I said, my voice more steady than I felt. I made the call, my hands shaking slightly as I held the receiver. The general's aide, a stern-sounding captain, informed me that the general was in a high-level briefing and could not be disturbed for at least 2 hours. I relayed the information to the old man, whose face fell with disappointment. As I hung up the phone, a different sound pierced the air. A familiar, buzzing vibration. It was my personal cell phone. I pulled it from my pocket and my blood ran cold. The screen was lit up and a name was flashing in bright, angry red letters, an incoming call notification I had customized myself. "Sergeant Evans." My breath hitched. I could feel her fury through the phone, a palpable wave of rage seeking me out for my earlier insubordination of walking out of the office. I glanced up at the old man. He was looking at me, his eyes filled with a new, hopeful trust. He was counting on me. Then I looked back down at the phone, which was screaming silently in my hand, a beacon of the world that wanted to crush me. I was standing at a crossroads. Behind me was the path of obedience, of fear, of falling back in line, the path of the broken stapler. Ahead of me was this unknown, terrifying, and strangely hopeful path. I knew my choice. With a steady thumb, I pressed the button on the side of the phone. The screen went dark. The buzzing stopped. I had silenced the call. I slipped my silenced phone back into my pocket. It continued to vibrate against my leg, a frantic, buzzing reminder of the storm I had just unleashed. But looking at the hopeful, trusting face of Robert Vance, I knew I couldn't just leave him sitting on a hard bench in this cold lobby for the next 2 hours. I had already jumped from the plane. There was no point in hesitating now. I raised my hands again, forming the words in our quiet language. "Sir," I signed, "the general will be busy for a couple of hours. Instead of waiting here, would you like me to show you the Don F. Pratt Division Museum? It's just a short walk. I think you might recognize a few things in there." A grateful smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He nodded enthusiastically. And just like that, I made the decision. I, Specialist Molly Collins, a clerk assigned to a desk, was officially AWOL from my post. I was abandoning my duties to give a private tour to the commanding general's father, willfully ignoring the escalating fury of my direct superior. It was, without a doubt, the most insane and insubordinate decision of my military career. and it felt absolutely right. We walked out of the headquarters building and into the warm afternoon sun. The short walk to the museum was peaceful, a fragile bubble of calm. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling faintly of old canvas and polished wood. The museum was a cathedral of memory, filled with the ghosts and glories of the 101st Airborne. And in this place, Robert Vance came alive. His weariness seemed to melt away, replaced by a vibrant energy I hadn't seen before. He moved from display to display, his eyes sharp and focused. He pointed to a glass case containing a PRC-25 radio, the iconic olive drab workhorse of the Vietnam War. He turned to me, his hands moving with a new urgency, painting pictures in the air. We called it the Prick 25, he signed, a mischievous glint in his eye. It was heavy, awkward. The battery was always dying. But at night, deep in the jungle, when you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face, this was our only lifeline. That weak little hiss of static in your ear was the only thing that told you that you weren't alone out there. He paused, his gaze distant, lost in a memory 50 years old and a world away. He told me about the friends he'd had in his platoon, young men from all over America. A farm boy from Iowa, a wisecracking kid from the Bronx. He spoke their names with his hands, names I recognized from the black granite walls outside. For him, they weren't just names etched in stone. They were still alive, still 18 and 19 years old, their laughter still echoing in the humid jungle nights. I realized with a sense of awe that I wasn't just getting a history lesson, I was being given a sacred inheritance, a story, passed down from one soldier to another. As he spoke, my phone buzzed again in my pocket. And again. I subtly pulled it out, shielding the screen with my hand. A string of text messages from Sergeant Evans had appeared. The first one read, "Collins, I am counting to 3. I quickly silenced the screen and slipped the phone away, my heart beginning to pound against my ribs. I tried to focus on Robert, who was now looking at a display of Viet Cong booby traps, his expression grim. Another buzz. I glanced down again. "This is your final warning. Return to your duty station immediately." Another. "Prepare to face a court-martial specialist." Each message was a cold splash of reality, a reminder of the consequences that were piling up with every passing minute. I was standing in a room dedicated to honor and sacrifice, while actively committing an act that could end my career in disgrace. The irony was suffocating. We spent over an hour in that hallowed space, walking a tightrope between a sacred past and a terrifying future. When we finally stepped back outside, the afternoon sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. The fresh air did nothing to calm the frantic anxiety that was now a cold knot in my stomach. My eyes were drawn, as if by a magnet, up to the imposing headquarters building. I scanned the windows of the top floor, the general's domain. And then, my heart stopped. He was there, standing in a large window on the corner of the building. General Michael Vance. Even from this distance, his presence was unmistakable. Tall, broad-shouldered, a figure of absolute authority. He was in his dress uniform, and he wasn't looking out at the horizon. He was looking straight down, at us. His face was a mask, utterly devoid of emotion. But his eyes? I could feel his gaze even from 100 yards away. It was a laser beam, pinning me to the spot. He saw me. He saw me with his father. He had seen everything. There was nowhere left to run. Nowhere to hide. The feeling of being caught, of being seen by that silent, all-powerful judge, was infinitely worse than all of Evans's shouted threats combined. My blood turned to ice. Somehow, I managed to get my feet to move. We walked back to the headquarters building, the silence between us now thick with my unspoken terror. As we stepped through the glass doors and back into the lobby, I saw her. Just as I knew she would be. Sergeant Evans was standing in the middle of the lobby, positioned like a predator waiting to ambush its prey. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was a blotchy, furious red. She didn't wait for us to get closer. "Specialist Collins!" she roared, her voice echoing off the marble floors. Every head in the lobby snapped in our direction. You have just made a very, very big mistake. Your duties here are terminated. She didn't even glance at the old man standing beside me, who looked startled and confused by this sudden, vicious hostility. Her eyes were locked on me, filled with a triumphant, venomous rage. The door to hell had just swung wide open. Sergeant Evans advanced on me, her boots clicking aggressively on the polished marble floor. Her face was a mask of pure fury, the veins in her neck standing out. "Who in the hell do you think you are, specialist?" she spat, her voice a low growl that carried across the cavernous lobby. She was close enough now that I could smell the stale coffee on her breath. "Going AWOL from your post? For what? To play tour guide for some homeless old man you found on the street?" Her eyes darted to Robert, who was standing beside me looking utterly bewildered by the venom being directed at us. She didn't address him directly. She waved a dismissive, crude hand in his direction, as if shooing away a stray dog. "The United States Army doesn't pay you for charity work, Collins," she snarled. Then she raised her voice, turning her insult into a public proclamation. "Hey, old man, go find somewhere else to hang out. This building isn't for freeloaders." Freeloaders! The word struck the air and seemed to hang there, a vile, poisonous thing. To say that in a civilian setting would be cruel. To say it here, in the heart of the 101st Airborne Division, a place built on the bedrock of sacrifice, to a man wearing a veteran's cap. It was more than an insult. It was blasphemy. It was a desecration. And in that instant, every ounce of fear I'd ever felt in my life, fear of Evans, of my father's disappointment, of my own failure, was incinerated by a sudden, cleansing fire of pure, righteous rage. The broken stapler was gone. The paratrooper was back. I took a half step forward, planting my feet firmly on the ground, and met her hateful glare with my own. "You shut your mouth, Sergeant," I yelled. My voice didn't tremble. It cracked like a whip through the stunned silence of the lobby, sharp and loud and utterly insubordinate. Every person within earshot froze, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You have no right to talk to him like that," I continued, my voice rising with every word, fueled by months of suppressed anger. "You see this man? He shed blood for this country when you were probably still in diapers. He's a soldier, just like you and me, and he has earned the right to be treated with respect, especially in this building." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a deafening, shattering void. A specialist had just screamed at a sergeant first class in the middle of division headquarters. The unthinkable had just happened. I could feel the collective gasp of everyone present. I had just thrown a grenade into the middle of my own career, and I didn't care. I was ready for the explosion. Evans's face went from red to a shade of purple I'd never seen before. Her mouth opened, a torrent of career-ending charges no doubt ready to pour out. But not a single sound emerged. Because another voice cut through the air, a voice that was not loud but held in its calm, quiet tone more power than a battalion of screaming drill sergeants. "That is enough, Sergeant." The voice came from directly behind us. It was cold as steel, sharp as forged ice. Every soldier in that lobby snapped to attention as if electrocuted. I turned slowly. Standing there, not 10 feet away, was General Michael Vance. He hadn't been in the window. He had been on his way down. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed, with a terrifying Arctic intensity, on Sergeant Evans. It was an intensity that could freeze hell over. The air temperature in the lobby seemed to drop 20 degrees. The homeless man you just insulted," the general said, his voice slow, deliberate, each word a perfectly weighted stone dropped into a silent pool. "The freeloader you tried to run out of my headquarters." He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, his eyes never leaving hers. "Is my father, Veteran Sergeant Robert Vance." If a bomb had detonated in the lobby, it would have been less shocking than those words. A wave of audible gasps swept through the onlookers. Sergeant Evans's face collapsed. The color drained from her skin, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. Her jaw worked, but no sounds came out. She looked like she was going to be physically ill right there on the polished floor of her own personal nightmare. General Vance didn't spare her another glance. He dismissed her as if she had ceased to exist, turning his back on her completely. He walked the few steps to his father, his expression softening from granite to something deeply pained. And then, in the dead, breathless silence of a lobby full of stunned soldiers, the most powerful man on Fort Campbell did something that no one could have ever predicted. He raised his hands. Awkwardly, hesitantly, he began to sign. His movements weren't as fluid as mine, his hand shapes a little clumsy, like someone still learning a difficult new language. But his meaning was perfectly, heartbreakingly clear. Dad, he signed, his eyes filled with a raw, profound regret. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let you go through this. Robert Vance reached out and placed a hand on his son's uniformed arm, a gesture of forgiveness and comfort that was both beautiful and agonizing to watch. After a long moment, the general lowered his hands. He turned, and his eyes found mine. The Arctic cold was gone, replaced by a complex, unreadable emotion. Gratitude, curiosity, something else I couldn't name. He looked at me, really looked at me, not as a specialist, not as a clerk, but as a person. Specialist Collins, he said, his voice now quiet and measured. With me. The walk from the lobby to General Vance's office was the longest and quietest of my life. My boots were silent on the plush hallway carpet, the only sound the steady, imposing tread of the general's dress shoes beside me. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, my body rigid with tension, my mind racing through every possible scenario. I was preparing for the end of my career. A court-martial, a dishonorable discharge. I had screamed at a senior NCO. I had abandoned my post. There was no coming back from this. His office was vast, occupying the corner of the building. One wall was covered in flags, the Stars and Stripes, the Army flag, the proud colors of the 101st Airborne Division. Another was filled with plaques, medals, and photos of him with senators and foreign dignitaries. Through the large window behind his mahogany desk, I could see the entire expanse of Fort Campbell spread out below. It was the view from Olympus. The general didn't sit down. He didn't yell. He walked past his desk and gestured toward one of the leather chairs facing it. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and heavy with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. Have a seat, specialist. I did as I was told, perching nervously on the edge of the expensive chair. He stood by the window with his back to me, looking out at the base he commanded. The silence stretched for a long, agonizing minute. I braced myself for the storm. When he turned around, there was no anger in his eyes, only a profound sadness. Today, you showed me something I've spent years deliberately ignoring, he began, his voice low. You showed me my own failure, as a son. I was so stunned I couldn't even form a thought. This was not the reprimand I had expected. This was a confession. He walked over to the small sitting area and sank into the armchair opposite me, the crisp fabric of his uniform rustling. My father, he's a good man, he said, his gaze unfocused, looking at a past I couldn't see. After my mother passed away a few years ago, he started to retreat. The world got quieter for him, and he just went with it. He pulled into himself, into that silence. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, looking more like a tired man than a two-star general. And I let him. I was busy. There was always a deployment, a briefing, a crisis in some corner of the world. I told myself I didn't have time to learn his new language. I told myself it was impractical. He shook his head, a gesture of deep self-reproach. I sent him money, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I bought him the best hearing aids technology could offer, a brand new television with closed captions. I gave him things. But I never gave him what he actually needed. My time. My understanding. He finally met my eyes, and the shame in them was raw and undisguised. Every time he comes to visit, a part of me sees it as an interruption, a problem to be managed. Today, you took that interruption and you turned it into a connection. You did what I, his own son, have failed to do for years. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, my heart aching for this powerful, lonely man. He took a deep breath, his military bearing returning slightly. So, no, specialist. I didn't call you in here to discipline you. I called you in here to thank you. The relief that washed over me was so intense it almost made me dizzy. Thank me? The idea was so far beyond what I had prepared for that I couldn't fully process it. That skill you have, he continued, shifting his focus. American Sign Language. Where did you learn it? My own story came tumbling out in a quiet, hesitant voice. I told him about my younger brother, Danny, about his diagnosis and my fear that he would be left behind in a world of sound. I told him about the hours spent learning and the joy of breaking through that wall of silence. And then, I told him what my own family thought of that skill. They don't understand either, I said, the words small but heavy with years of hurt. My mother, she called it a hobby. General Vance nodded slowly, a look of profound understanding on his face. The most valuable gifts are often the ones the world overlooks, he said softly. It reminds me of a story my pastor used to tell back home in Tennessee, the story of the Good Samaritan. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. You know the one. A man is beaten, left for dead on the side of the road. The important people, the priest, the Levite, they see him and they cross the street. They have important things to do, places to be. They walk right by. It's only the outsider, the Samaritan, the one nobody expected anything from, who stops. He's the only one who takes the time to help. He looked directly at me, and in that moment, I wasn't a specialist anymore. I was a person he truly saw. Today, Collins, you were the Good Samaritan in my lobby. He stood up then, his energy shifting from confessional to decisive. He walked behind his desk, his voice regaining its command. Collins, this division doesn't need another broken stapler, he said, his words sharp and deliberate. He had taken Sergeant Evans's cruelest insult and was now turning it into a weapon of his own. It needs a heart. It needs a conscience. And I want you to be that conscience. My breath caught in my throat. He laid out a vision that was so audacious, so far beyond anything I could have ever imagined, that it felt like a dream. He spoke of creating a new position, an integration and liaison officer, someone whose sole job was to connect with soldiers and families facing unique challenges, disabilities, mental health struggles, communication barriers. He talked about sending me to officer candidate school. He wasn't offering me a promotion. He was offering me a mission. A chance to change the entire culture of the division from the inside out. He stopped, letting the weight of his proposal settle in the quiet room. He fixed me with an intense, penetrating gaze. This won't be easy, he said, his voice a low, serious rumble. You'll be changing a system that doesn't like to be changed. You'll face resistance. This division is full of sergeants like the one you met today. He leaned forward slightly, his expression a final, crucial challenge. I can give you the authority. But I need to know. Do you have the courage to take on this fight? This is the part of the story where one small act of kindness changes everything. If you believe that a single person can make a difference, even when the world tells them they're useless, please hit that like button to support Molly's new mission. And in the comments, let me know, have you ever been a good Samaritan for someone, or has someone been one for you? 6 months felt like a lifetime. The person who returned to Fort Campbell was not the same one who had left. I came back from officer candidate school with gold bars on my uniform and a new name, Second Lieutenant Molly Collins. My new office was small but strategically located just down the hall from General Vance's. It was a clear signal of his patronage, a silent warning to anyone who might think of obstructing my work. On my desk, a polished wooden plaque read, Integration and Liaison Officer. It was real. This impossible mission was real. My first task was to organize a mandatory training session for all platoon sergeants and senior NCOs across the division. I named it Special Assistance and Awareness Training. The name was deliberately bland, bureaucratic, designed to slide under the radar. But the content was my entire heart and soul. I spent weeks preparing the presentation, poring over Army regulations on compassionate reassignment and family care. Robert Vance, who now visited the post regularly, became my unofficial consultant, providing the invaluable perspective of a veteran who had seen the system fail his brothers time and again. I went into that training session armed with facts, passion, and a genuine belief that I could make a difference. The training was a complete and utter disaster. I stood at the podium in a sterile, white-walled classroom, facing a sea of stone-faced NCOs. There were about 40 of them in the room, mostly sergeants first class and master sergeants, men and women with decades of combined experience. They sat with their arms crossed tightly over their chests, their expressions ranging from bored indifference to outright skepticism. Their hostility was a palpable force in the room, a thick wall of institutional inertia. To them, I was just a brand new, wet-behind-the-ears lieutenant with a fancy title and a soft idea cooked up by the general. I was wasting their valuable time that could be spent on the range, in the motor pool, or training soldiers for the only thing that mattered: combat. I tried my best. I presented statistics on soldier retention, spoke about the unique stressors on military families with special needs, and outlined the resources available to them. But I was talking to a brick wall. They stared at me with dead eyes, their message clear: this has nothing to do with us. Halfway through the presentation, a sergeant first class in the back row, a big, burly man I recognized as a close friend of Evan's, raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with condescending formality. "With all due respect, this all sounds very nice. But we train soldiers to be soldiers. We train them for combat. We are not social workers." A low ripple of smug laughter and muttered agreements spread through the room. "Hooah," someone whispered from the back. My face flushed hot. In that moment, with all those cynical eyes on me, I wasn't an officer anymore. I was right back at my old desk, the scent of spilled coffee in my nostrils. I was the broken stapler, all over again. The rest of the session was a blur of me talking to a room that had already tuned me out. When it was finally over, they filed out quickly, eager to escape. As I was packing up my laptop, a shadow fell over the podium. It was Sergeant Evans, or rather, Staff Sergeant Evans. After the incident in the lobby, she'd been demoted and transferred to a dreary supply depot on the far side of the post. Seeing her now, the bitterness had settled deep in her features, carving new lines around her mouth. "Enjoying the new job, Lieutenant?" she asked, her voice a low, venomous drawl. The word lieutenant was an insult the way she said it. "I'm trying to make a difference, Sergeant," I said, keeping my voice even. She let out a short, harsh laugh. "You got what you wanted, you got your shiny new rank. But you're a fool if you think you can change anything. This is the Army, Collins. It's bigger and older than you, and it doesn't change for idealists. It chews them up and spits them out." She leaned closer, her eyes glittering with resentment. "You'll see. You'll fail. And I'll be here to watch." She turned and walked away, leaving her toxic words hanging in the air behind her. As I walked back to my empty office, her prophecy echoed in my head. It chews them up and spits them out. Was she right? Was this whole mission just a fool's errand, a naive dream destined to be crushed by the gears of a massive, unfeeling machine? For the first time, a seed of doubt began to sprout in my heart. That evening, I sat in my small, sterile apartment off-post, a half-eaten lean cuisine forgotten on the coffee table. The silence was deafening. The initial fire of my new purpose had been reduced to a smoldering ember of frustration and self-doubt. Then, my phone rang. The caller ID read, "Dad." My heart tensed. I braced myself for another lecture, another round of disappointed questions. "Molly," he said when I answered. His voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Heard you made lieutenant." "Yes, Dad, a few months ago." There was a long pause. I could hear the faint sound of the television in the background of their living room. I don't really understand this new job of yours," he admitted, and I could hear the struggle in his voice. It was hard for him to talk about things he didn't have a frame of reference for. "But Danny," he told me what happened. The whole story. Another pause. "He told me you used that hobby of yours to help an old soldier who was lost. He told me you didn't turn away." The line went quiet again, but this time it wasn't a silence of judgment. It was a silence filled with a lifetime of unspoken words. "I'm proud of you, Molly." The words were quiet, a little rough around the edges, but they hit me with the force of a tidal wave. It was the one thing I had spent my entire life trying to earn, the one thing I'd finally given up on ever hearing. And it had come now, in my moment of deepest doubt, when I needed it the most. My father's words echoed in my mind for days, a quiet source of strength that insulated me from the sting of my initial failure. His pride, so long withheld, had given me the clarity I needed. I had been approaching the problem like the old army, with a top-down directive, a mandatory briefing, a PowerPoint presentation full of cold facts and statistics. I had been trying to order people to care, but my father hadn't been moved by my new rank or the title on my office door. He had been moved by a story. A simple story about a small act of kindness. That's when I realized my mistake. You can't command compassion. You have to cultivate it. You have to give it a reason to grow. I threw out my entire strategy. I canceled the remaining mandatory briefings and the sterile classroom lectures. In their place, I organized a series of voluntary town hall meetings at the Post Community Center. There were no podiums, no presentations, just chairs arranged in a circle, a pot of lukewarm coffee, and a simple invitation flyer posted around the base. You are not alone. Come and share your story. The first meeting was small. Only a dozen people showed up, mostly nervous young military spouses, their eyes wary. I didn't lecture them. I just sat with them in the circle, took a sip of coffee, and told them my story. I told them about my brother, Danny. I told them about my own feelings of isolation and being misunderstood. And then, I just listened. Word began to spread. The next meeting had 30 people. The one after that had 50. It turned out Fort Campbell was filled with silent stories. Stories of depression, of anxiety, of children with disabilities, of financial struggles. All the messy human problems that get hidden behind the perfect facade of military discipline and strength. The breakthrough came a month later. I was hosting a town hall specifically for NCOs and their families. The room was tense, the wives were there, but most of the soldiers looked like they'd been dragged there against their will. Among them, I recognized the big Sergeant First Class who had publicly challenged me in that first disastrous training session. He sat in the back, his arms crossed, a thunderous scowl on his face. About halfway through the meeting, a woman stood up hesitantly. It was his wife. She was a small, quiet woman who looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. My name is Sarah, she began, her voice trembling. My husband is Sergeant First Class Rick Peterson. Her husband stiffened in his chair, his scowl deepening. We have a son, she continued, her voice cracking. He's 8 years old. His name is Leo, and he has autism. Tears began to stream down her face. And I am so lonely, she whispered, the words a raw, painful admission. I love this community, but it can be a hard place. There are expectations. Your kids are supposed to be a certain way. Your family is supposed to be perfect. I've never told anyone this, never really talked about it because I was so scared. Scared people would judge us. Scared it would affect my husband's career. The room was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. For the first time, the men in that room weren't looking at a problem. They weren't analyzing a special needs case. They were looking at a mother, the wife of one of their own, a member of their tribe who was hurting. In that moment of shared, vulnerable silence, the walls of cynicism and indifference began to crumble. A few days later, there was a knock on my office door. It was Sergeant First Class Rick Peterson. He stood in my doorway, refusing to come all the way in. He wouldn't make eye contact, his gaze fixed on a recruitment poster on the wall behind me. He didn't apologize for what he'd said in the classroom. He wasn't that kind of man. But his next words were more powerful than any apology could ever be. Lieutenant, he said, his voice a low, gruff rumble. My wife, she felt better after that meeting. She said she wasn't alone. He cleared his throat, still not looking at me. I want to start a support group for other NCO parents with autistic kids. I don't know how. I was wondering if if you could help us. I looked at this tough, combat-hardened soldier, this man who had publicly ridiculed my mission, now humbly asking for my help. It was a victory more profound than any medal, more satisfying than any promotion. The change hadn't come from an order signed by General Vance, it had come from the tears of a lonely wife in a community center. After that, the floodgates opened. My little program exploded. Support groups started popping up all over the post, organized and run by the soldiers and spouses themselves, a group for parents of special needs children, a confidential support network for soldiers struggling with PTSD, a financial counseling group for young enlisted families. My office became a hub, a nerve center of compassion and connection. I named the initiative Operation Silent Listener. I invited General Vance and his father to one of the meetings. Robert Vance shared his stories of Vietnam, of the friends he lost, and the silence he came home to. General Vance, in his full-dress uniform, spoke with raw honesty about the burden of command and the guilt of being a son who didn't listen closely enough. They became living symbols of our mission, a testament to the healing that happens when we finally bridge the silence between us. The stories of what was happening at Fort Campbell started to ripple outwards. An Army Times reporter wrote a feature on the program. Then other bases started calling, asking how they could replicate our model. One bright Tuesday morning, General Vance walked into my office without knocking. He was holding a copy of the Stars and Stripes newspaper, and he had a smile on his face so wide it looked like it might crack his famously stoic expression. "Operation Silent Listener just made a bit of a splash, Lieutenant," he said, his eyes beaming with pride. "A big one, actually. The story has made its way up the chain of command, all the way up." He paused for dramatic effect, his smile growing wider. "Get your dress uniform ready, Lieutenant Collins. We have an appointment in Washington, D.C. It seems some folks at the Pentagon want to hear our story." The Pentagon Auditorium was a sea of dark blue and green uniforms, the dress blues and army greens of the nation's highest-ranking military leaders. The air was thick with the scent of achievement and power. Silver stars glittered on shoulders and collars everywhere I looked. Standing on that stage, under the warm, bright lights, I felt a million miles away from the broken specialist who had once wiped spilled coffee off a cheap laminate desk. I had a carefully prepared speech folded on the lectern in front of me, full of formal acknowledgments and professional gratitude. I never even glanced at it. Instead, I looked out at the rows of decorated officers, at General Vance sitting in the front row with his father beside him, and I decided to just tell them the truth. "Less than a year ago," I began, my voice steady and clear in the silent room, "my supervisor told me I was a broken stapler, a useless piece of office equipment, and the worst part is, I believed her. I told them everything. I told them about the humiliation, the loneliness, and the feeling of being discarded. I told them about the phone call with my family and the casual, devastating dismissal of a skill I had learned out of love. I told them what it felt like to be seen as worthless by the two worlds that were supposed to define me, the Army and my own family. And then," I continued, "I met a quiet, forgotten veteran at a memorial wall, and he reminded me that the very skill everyone called a useless hobby was actually a key that could unlock a door someone else had closed. He reminded me that listening isn't a passive act, it's a powerful one." I paused, letting my story settle in the quiet room. I looked at the powerful men and women in front of me, the architects of our nation's defense. "The true strength of the United States Army," I said, my voice ringing with a conviction I had earned through fire, "isn't just in our tanks, our helicopters, or our rifles. It's in the heart of every single soldier. And a heart is only as strong as its capacity to care. A soldier is only as strong as their willingness to listen. True strength is bending down to lift up a fallen comrade who is fighting a silent battle of their own." I let my gaze linger for a moment, and then I spoke the final words. A message not for the generals, but for the family watching on a television screen in a small house in Clarksville, Tennessee. "And to my family," I said, my voice softening, "thank you for the gift of silence. It taught me how to truly listen." When the small passenger plane touched down at the Clarksville Regional Airport, my heart was pounding harder than it had been at the Pentagon. Awards were one thing. Home was another. As I walked down the metal steps onto the tarmac, the first person I saw was Danny. He was waving both arms over his head, a huge, ecstatic grin on his face. And standing next to him, her posture stiff and uncertain, was my mother. My father stood beside her, his old Marine Corps bearing as rigid as ever, but his eyes were on me. I walked toward them, my steps getting faster. Before I could reach him, my mother rushed forward, closing the distance between us. She threw her arms around me in an embrace that was tight, desperate, and trembling. I felt the dampness of her tears on the shoulder of my uniform. "I'm so sorry, Molly," she whispered, her voice thick with a regret that felt raw and real. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. You're not just a paratrooper. You're a hero." My father stepped forward and put a hand on my other shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just squeezed, once. It was his language, his version of 1,000 words. In the warm circle of their arms, with Danny beaming at my side, I finally felt the last broken piece of my old life click perfectly into place. I was whole. The story could have ended there. But the legacy, I discovered, had a life of its own. A few months later, I was standing on the edge of a training field at Fort Campbell. It was a crisp, clear autumn day. Next to me stood General Vance and his father, Robert. We were watching a group of new, young soldiers, fresh out of basic training. They were gathered in a semicircle, their faces a mixture of concentration and awkwardness. At the front of the group, patiently guiding them through the alphabet in American Sign Language, was their instructor. She wore the rank of a sergeant on her sleeve, newly restored. It was Evans. She had been given a choice after her disciplinary action: a transfer to a dead-end job in another state, or a chance to be part of the solution here. To everyone's surprise, she had chosen to stay. She had chosen to learn. Robert Vance nudged my arm gently. I looked at him, and he smiled, his hands moving with that familiar, graceful ease. "Look," he signed, his eyes twinkling. "A new symphony." I smiled back, a deep, peaceful feeling settling in my soul. I was no longer a ghost behind a desk. I was no longer a broken stapler. I was a conductor of sorts. And I had helped teach an entire division of Screaming Eagles how to create the most beautiful music of all: the Symphony of Empathy. My journey started in a place of silence and shame, but it ended with a symphony. It taught me that our greatest strength isn't found in the noise we make, but in our willingness to truly listen to the silence of others, to see the person everyone else overlooks. Your story matters too. Your voice and your unique gifts deserve to be heard. If my story has moved you, please hit the like button to show your support and subscribe to the channel for more stories about turning our deepest struggles into our greatest strengths. And in the comments below, I would love for you to share one thing. Who is one person in your life you are grateful for, because they truly listened when you needed it most? Thank you for listening to my story. Until next time, take care of each other.